The sound of roller skates still echoed in the empty rink long after Theresa Fusco disappeared. It was November 10, 1984, a Long Island night cold enough to burn through denim. She was 16, just off her shift at the roller castle in Lynbrook, and told a friend she was walking home. She never made it. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Days later, her mother filed a missing person report. At first, police thought Theresa had run away. She was young, spirited, and the 80s were full of stories about teenagers skipping town. But by the third week, the optimism had faded. Search teams combed through wooded lots and drainage ditches, their flashlights slicing through fog and silence. Then, on a frigid December morning, they found her. Theresa's body lay hidden beneath leaves and branches in a patch of woods not far from her home. The discovery shattered the small community, the kind of town where people left doors unlocked and knew their neighbors by name. Detectives said it was brutal. The press called it the Long Island Horror. Pressure to solve the case grew fast. The police needed answers, someone to blame. Within months, 3 local young men, all in their early 20s, were hauled into interrogation rooms. They were scared, confused, and alone. None of them knew it then, but their lives were about to be destroyed. The confessions came after hours of questioning. There were inconsistencies, but the investigators said they had their men. The prosecution built a story that sounded airtight. These 3 friends had abducted Theresa, attacked her, and left her for dead. By 1986, all 3 were convicted of rape and murder. The courtroom gasped as the sentences were read, decades behind bars. The victim's family wept, believing justice had been served. The public moved on. But inside the cells of New York's correctional system, something festered. The convicted men, John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead, refused to confess, even when it could have earned them parole. They claimed they were innocent. Year after year, they wrote letters to journalists, lawyers, anyone who would listen. Inmates called them the Roller Rink 3. Guards saw them as another set of killers to manage. But among the concrete and razor wire, they held on to one thing the system couldn't take: time. And time was the only thing that could bring the truth back to the surface. Because decades later, when the world had nearly forgotten Theresa Fusco's name, a single strand of DNA, invisible in 1984, would whisper the story that no one wanted to hear. The sound of the steel door closing wasn't justice, it was finality. For the 3 young men accused of killing Theresa Fusco, that echo marked the beginning of a nightmare none of them could have imagined. Inside New York's prison system, innocence didn't matter. Conviction did. John Kogut, John Restivo, and Dennis Halstead were now the villains in one of Long Island's most horrifying crimes. The papers said they were monsters. The guards believed it. And the other inmates? They didn't ask questions, they just saw 3 men convicted of killing a teenage girl. Life behind bars became a test of endurance. The cell blocks were loud, but silence was the only safe response. Kogut, once an easygoing auto mechanic, learned to keep his head down. Restivo, who'd driven a van the police claimed was used in the abduction, spent most days replaying the interrogation in his mind, wondering how truth could lose so easily. Halstead, older and tougher, became their protector, the one who told them to survive first, fight later. They wrote letters, hundreds of them. Pleas to attorneys, journalists, and organizations that might believe them. But the world outside had moved on. Their story was just another headline fading into the archives of 1980s crime hysteria. In prison, they learned how fragile identity could be. Their names were gone, replaced by numbers and rumors. Even when they proclaimed innocence, few listened. "Everybody says that in here," one guard told Kogut. But he wasn't lying. None of them were. By the mid-1990s, the world was changing. DNA technology was rewriting the rules of forensic science. Across the country, cases once thought sealed shut began to crack open. Lawyers from a small nonprofit called the Innocence Project took interest in the Fusco case. They believed DNA evidence could finally tell the truth the system had buried. It took years, requests, court orders, endless waiting. Evidence from 1984 had been boxed, sealed, and nearly forgotten. When it was finally tested, the results were shocking. The biological material found on Theresa Fusco's body didn't match any of the 3 men who had spent nearly 2 decades behind bars. The system had convicted the wrong people. In 2003, after 18 years in prison, John Kogut was the first to walk free. The courtroom was silent when the judge read the decision. Restivo and Halstead followed soon after. The men who had entered prison in their 20s left as middle-aged strangers to the world. Freedom, however, didn't erase the years they'd lost. Each carried invisible scars, the paranoia, the sleepless nights, the memories of chains. And yet, for a moment, there was hope. The truth had spoken. DNA had cleared their names. But what DNA gave, it also demanded. Because buried in that same science was another question: if they didn't do it, then who did? Nearly 2 decades later, technology would answer. And the man behind that answer was still walking free, blending into the world like nothing had ever happened. For decades, the name Theresa Fusco lingered like unfinished business in Long Island's memory. Her family had endured it all: the trials, the false justice, and the painful revelation that the real killer was still out there. The 3 wrongfully convicted men had been freed, compensated, and vindicated. Yet somewhere, the truth remained unfinished. Detectives never stopped asking the same haunting question: who killed Theresa? By 2024, technology had advanced in ways that detectives in 1984 could never have imagined. DNA testing could extract a full profile from the smallest trace, a touch, a breath, even a sip from a straw. When investigators reopened the Fusco file, they ran every preserved sample through modern forensic databases. The profile that had once exonerated Kogut, Restivo, and Halstead was still unmatched. Until one day, a lab technician made a connection that changed everything. It started with something ordinary: a discarded smoothie straw left behind by a man in his 60s, living quietly in New York. When police retrieved it, they didn't know if it would mean anything. But when the results came back, it was undeniable: the DNA matched the biological evidence found on Theresa Fusco's body nearly 40 years earlier. The man's name was Richard Bilodeau, 63 years old. He wasn't on anyone's radar. Back in the 1980s, he lived near the same area, worked odd jobs, and stayed out of trouble. There was no reason anyone would have suspected him until the science caught up. In 2024, Nassau County prosecutors presented the evidence to a grand jury. The indictment came swiftly: 2 counts of murder. When police approached Bilodeau, he denied everything, pleading not guilty. But this time, the case wasn't built on shaky confessions or speculation. It was built on something that didn't exist in 1984: DNA certainty. The courtroom that once condemned the innocent now stood ready to face the truth. Families, journalists, and survivors of wrongful convictions filled the benches. The Fusco family, older now but still searching for peace, watched quietly as the man accused of killing their daughter stood in handcuffs. There was no victory in that moment, only the heavy silence that comes when time finally catches up to justice. For the exonerated men, the news brought mixed emotions. Relief that the truth was found. Anger that it took 4 decades. And sorrow that nothing could restore the years stolen from their lives. Theresa's case became more than a story about murder. It became a story about the fallibility of justice and the persistence of truth. A story that began with flawed investigations and ended with a single piece of plastic that carried a killer's secret for 40 years. As cameras flashed and the headlines spread, cold case solved after nearly 4 decades, one question remained: how many more stories like Theresa's still wait for technology, time, and truth to align? Because justice delayed isn't justice denied, it's justice waiting for a voice strong enough to be heard. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.